Hello everyone, so last episode we left off where we were able to write our dialogue files and make our characters enter and start executing actions based off of the casting data that we send for these characters. Now we're going to take this a step further and start implementing some commands for our characters. Over the past couple episodes, we've been establishing some commands for each of our character types. This gives us some different commands that apply to all the characters and some commands that apply to character types in particular, like our 3D models and what have you. But all of these are going to be commands that we can execute directly from the dialog files, and for us to be able to do that, we're going to have to make an extension to our database. Our command manager database, that is. Now, there are two different ways I would like to be able to call commands for our characters. That'll make it a little easier for us in certain scenarios. So we'll have what I'm going to refer to as global commands, which we can call and just reference the character inside of the command, such as if we want to show a character on screen, we'll type show followed by the character name. And then we'll also do local commands, which can be run directly from any character that has been created in the scene. So we could just reference the character's name and then call their command. By giving ourselves the options for this for certain commands, then it'll make it a little easier in the long run when we actually write our files and start using command upon command. Such as for the global command, we could specify multiple characters. And for our local command, we can just specify the single character and then pass in the parameters that we want, and sometimes that might just be a little better for you to write. But we're going to start simple, and we're just going to go with this command setup right here, using the global commands like we've set up for our temporary commands so far. So of course, in order for us to add new commands to this system, our command manager needs a new database extension that can run these commands for our character types. So let's make a new script inside of the extensions folder and call it something like cmd database extension characters, as this will contain all of the commands for our characters. So let's go ahead and make sure that we encapsulate this into our namespace for the command system. And then let's make sure that we are inheriting from the database extension. And then we can remove start and update. And that one function that we want to create here is, of course, the extend method. Now, most of the commands that we've created for our characters are coroutines, which can be run over time, so most of the commands that we're going to be adding are going to be IEnumerators. So let's start with those show and hide commands, so that way we can control the visibility of our characters. So I'm just going to make the IEnumerators down here. Our first one is going to be a public static void called show. At which point we're going to take an array of parameters for our data. And we'll do the same thing for our hide command. But I'm actually going to name this show all and hide all because these are going to be the global functions. So I can specify multiple characters in here. Okay, and to add these commands to our database, we'll go ahead and reference database.add command and then create our commands, which will be show, and show is going to take in a new function with a string array for the data and a type of IEnumerator, and this is going to be show all. But I'm getting squiggly lines because this should not be a void, it should be a IEnumerator. Okay, so there's that. We can go ahead and duplicate this line, and now say hide, and this will be hide all. And so these commands can now be run, but we need to give them some logic. Now, there are a lot of commands that we're going to be adding into this system. For every command that you make available into your characters that you can call and do anything with them, you need to make a command that is added to the database. So if I go through every single one of these and type all of these out, we're going to be spending a long time just typing out all these functions. That in my opinion is very unnecessary. I believe we're all smart enough to figure a lot of this stuff out on our own. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this one, and just so we can all follow along, because there are a couple things that we're going to add in here. And for the remainder of the commands, I might show some of them, but for the most part, I'm just going to show the finished command and talk about it for a minute and then move on to the next, just so that way I don't really waste a whole lot of screen time here, but we all get to see the finished function anyway and get a good idea of how it runs and how it should look. Because not everyone is on the same coding level, but I know that everyone is smart enough to figure out how to do most of this on your own. So we're going to go through it, but I'm going to do it fairly quickly once we get past these first couple ones. So we're starting with show all. And inside of this command, we're going to specify any number of characters that we want to reveal on screen. So let's go ahead and create ourselves a list for all of these characters. We'll just use the base character type because the function for showing and hiding is available to that class. We'll just call this characters and assign this to a new list of character. But of course, I need to use the character namespace using characters. There we go. So we get a new list of characters, and then we need to go through this data array and find out all of the characters that we have in here. So Visual Studio Auto added this little for loop for me. And now let's go ahead and try to grab this character. So we'll say character equals character manager.instance.get character. And we're going to try to get the character by this name. And we're also going to just make sure it does default to false, but I'm just going to go ahead and show this anyway, so that way for visual reference, I know we are not creating this character. We're only trying to retrieve it if it exists in the scene. And so if our character is not equal to null, then we're going to add this to our characters list. And now, if we have characters, so if characters.count equals 0, if we don't have any characters, we're not going to do anything, and we're just going to yield break. We should not be doing anything if we don't have any characters to operate on. But if we do, then we're going to want to show them, and maybe there's some parameters that we can add in here. So if we just open up our character script here and go to show and hide, what sort of parameters do we have? So we don't have any parameters, but what we do have is an option to either show them with a transition, which is what this command does by default, or immediately set them to visible by using the, the isVisible virtual boolean here. So we can either do it immediately or we can do it over time. So let's go ahead and specify up top with our characters list a boolean for immediate, which will tell us if we are making this an immediate transition or not. And we're going to want to find the parameter inside of this. So our command manager already split up all of the parameters into this data array. So everything separated by the space, unless it's in quotation marks, is going to be a separate element in this data array. So let's take a look at the test file real quick and just see what this might look like. In the test file, we could call show, followed by all these character names. Oh, actually, there shouldn't be any commas. I'm not using that format. So separating them by spaces, and so I'm essentially going to say show all of these characters, and then maybe what I could do is I could specify a value identifier, which could be I for immediate, and set that to true if I want it to be an immediate transition, or maybe I could do show by default, which would have or immediate by default, and then I will want to specify immediate as false to do a transition. So really, this is what we're going to be looking for. I'm going to be looking for a parameter with this name. Now, I could go through and do a for loop and try to find this in here, but with as many commands as we're going to be making, I want a more efficient way to locate the parameters than just iterating through this list all the time. So we're going to make a separate data structure that will convert this data array into that we can use to search for the parameters that are applicable to this particular function. For us to do that, I'm going to make a new class, create C# script, and call this command parameters. Again, command parameters I'm going to place inside of the command namespace. Going to remove mono behavior because I don't need that. And remove these functions here. So inside command parameters, what I want to do is I want to make myself a dictionary of all the parameters that I've defined and their relating values that are associated to them. We'll go ahead and make this a private dictionary, and this is just going to be two string values, a string for the identifier of the parameter and a string for the value, and we'll just call this parameters. Okay, so now let's go ahead and make a constructor to make this very easy to go ahead and just create this for us. So public parameter or command parameters. There we are. Okay, so let's go ahead and start by passing in the array of data. Or we can just call this maybe our parameter array. So let's go ahead and loop through these values and store all of our parameters. So let's do a for loop for int I equals 0 while I is less than parameter array dot length then I plus plus. And we're going to go through each one of these and check if it starts with the parameter identifier. So my identifier is going to be a value that starts with the minus symbol. So right up top, I'm just going to go ahead and define that. Private constant character parameter identifier equals the minus symbol. Anything that starts with the minus is going to identify some sort of parameter. So we can check if parameter array I dot starts with our parameter identifier, then we know that this is a valid parameter that we need to save the data for. So let's go ahead and get the name of it. String p name equals parameter array I, and then string p value equals, we'll do nothing right now, because we need to see if we actually have a value. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next item in the array and see if it's a valid value for us. We can do this by checking if I, our current index plus 1, is less than the parameter array dot length. If it is, then we know that we have another value that comes after this. So let's make sure that it's not another identifier. And not parameter array, we'll do I plus 1 to get the next value, dot starts with our parameter identifier. So if we have another value and it's not another identifier, then we know it is the value. So our p value will equal the parameter array I plus plus, and then we'll go ahead and say I plus plus. Now we're already incrementing here, but since we're gathering the value from the next item in the array, we want to go ahead and increment it another time. That way we're technically skipping ahead 2. Now you could go ahead and say I plus equals 2 and do away with that, but then that leaves in the factor of what if you make a mistake and you don't type in a value. Then your offset is going to be all jacked up. So we'll just stick to I plus plus and increment it again only if we have a good value. So now let's go ahead and add what we have to the dictionaries. So we'll go parameters.add our p name and our p value. So now, if we have these command parameters, well, first of all, let's go ahead and create it. Let's go back to our database. Let me save that real quick. Go back to our database extension, and now let's create these parameters. And again, since I'm going to make this for each one of our commands, basically, for any ones that I want to search for these parameters with, I'm just going to add another function into our database extension that will be a shortcut for us to just create these parameters. So let's make a public command parameters and say convert data to parameters. And we'll take a string array for the data, and then we'll point that to our creating a new command parameter using the data that is passed in. So for our characters, we can go ahead and say, let's convert the data array to a parameter container, and we'll say var parameters equals convert to, should have that come up. I just need to make this static. That needs to be static. Okay, equals convert to data to parameters, and we'll pass in our data. Okay, so now that we've got it all in our little dictionary, what we can do is now come in and make a function to grab the parameters that we're looking for. We're going to make a little function that can return any one of several values. We'll do a string, a boolean, a float, and an integer, just to start off with. There may be more later, but these are going to be the 4 common parameters that you'll pass into any command. So let's do it kind of in the style of how a dictionary has the try get component, or function rather. So you could say like dictionary try get this value, and it'll return a boolean if it found it, and it'll also cast out what it found into a variable of your choice. So let's do a very similar thing here. So let's make a public, come on now, let's make public boolean, and we'll actually call it the same thing for a dictionary. Try get value, and then inside of alligator brackets, let's add T, which just stands for type. So this represents any type of data that we want to cast this into. And let's go ahead and define a string for the parameter that we're looking for. So the parameter name, and then we're going to cast whatever we find, if we find it, out into the type for our value. And if we don't find it, it might be useful for us to specify a default value that the parameter can default to, just in case it's not defined. So we'll also make this a type called default value. And so we don't have to specify one. We'll just go ahead and set it to the default of whatever type it is that we're working with. Now, actually, I might make 2 variants of this, because I might in some cases just look for one parameter name. I may look for multiples that could resolve to the same parameter. So for our test file, we could have -i, which would be for immediate, or we could also spell out immediate. So then I would be able to look for 2 different names that would resolve to the same parameter. So let's go ahead and just make another one of these. And only this time we'll make it an array and call it parameter names. And so if we call this first one, all we're going to do is cast that to try get value. And we're going to make a new string array for our with our parameter name inside of it. And we're going to cast out what we find to our value. And we're also going to pass in the default value that we may specify. So we can either use one value or multiples to find a certain parameter. Okay, now, so let's go through and see if we have this in our dictionary. Let's make a little for each loop and go through our parameters, all the ones that we specify here. Okay, so let's take a look at the parameters that we compiled earlier. Let's just see if we've got it. So if parameters dot try get value, we're going to be looking for the parameter name, and we're going to cast it out into a temporary string for the parameter value. If we find it, then we need to try to cast it to one of the 4 data types. So let's make a separate function to do that for us. We'll call this a private boolean, and we'll just call it try cast parameter. Again, specifying our type. And inside of our brackets, we'll go ahead and specify the string for the parameter value and out for whatever kind of value type that we want to cast it to. So inside of here, if we have a parameter by this name, we'll go ahead and say if try cast parameter by this parameter value out value. Then we're going to return true because we found what we were looking for. Otherwise, we're going to say that value equals the default value, and we're going to return false. So either way, our value is getting assigned. It's either getting the default value or what we specified as a parameter in the command, and it'll return us true or false whether it actually found it or not. So as far as casting the parameter, here's how we're going to handle this. We're going to use the type of to analyze this t value and check if it's a Boolean, integer, float, or string, and then try to parse it and return whatever we find. So let's start off with a Boolean. So if type of t equals type of bool, so if the value we're trying to cast to is a Boolean, then let's go ahead and try to parse it as a Boolean. So if bool.tryParse, we're going to try to parse the parameter value, and we're going to try to parse this out to a temporary value called bool value. And if we find it, then our value will equal our t, our type, and then we're going to go ahead and assign our value. So we'll say value equals the type of t. We're going to cast our Boolean value to this type, but we need to specify object right before our Boolean value. The reason we got to do that, you'll see if I take out object here, we'll actually get ourselves an error saying that bool cannot be converted to type t. It doesn't exactly know how to do that yet, so we have to convert it to object because all of the .NET objects derive from, well, this object class. And once we have an object, then we can perform the secondary cast to the type that we're trying to get it to. So type object and then the temporary value that we cast this data out to. If we get that, we'll go ahead and return true and we're good to go. So we can go ahead and copy this. Actually, no, we'll copy this section and give ourselves a little else if type t equals type of integer, then we'll go ahead and say int, okay. We'll go ahead and say int.tryParse parameter value out int to the int value, and we'll return the integer. And we'll go ahead and do that for our last remaining two types as well. So that's going to be for our float. So we'll have a float, and we'll try to do a float.tryParse out float. I don't know why I keep doing that. We just r float value. Okay. And then if we reach the very end, well, we've already got the string value, so we can just return it as is. So we'll go ahead and say else, remove all of that. We'll go ahead and say else, value equals parameter value, unchanged. And lastly, we need to check if the type that we're trying to get is a string. If it is, then, well, we don't need to do any parsing, so we can remove that. And we'll just do the conversion to the type from the object, and we'll just say parameter value. Because value is not a straight up string, we don't know what it is. It's only defined based off of what we pass in as the value. So we still need to do the conversion even though our original data is a string. So we'll return true if we find any of those. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say value equals default t, and we'll go ahead and return false. So with this, we can go ahead and try to find the parameter that we pass into our function. So let's go back to the character database, and let's go ahead and look for that immediate parameter. So this is going to be pretty simple. All we'll do is just one little line. We'll reference our parameters, try get value, and we're going to try to find, we could pass in just straight up I, and then we would just cast out what we want to the immediate boolean that we defined above, and I'll go ahead and set a default value to false, because I do want a transition to be standard for this type of function. But also, I want to be able to define two different ways, or two different identifiers. I can either type out the whole thing or just the shorthand. So to do that, I will instead type new string array and then give myself two options. And that would either be -i or -immediate. So if this finds it, it's going to go ahead and cache out our value straight into the boolean up ahead, so we don't have to do anything else as far as that search goes, and we can go ahead and start working with the logic. So now let's go through each of our characters. So for each character in characters, let's go ahead and check. If immediate, then character.isVisible equals true, because we are trying to show something. Else, wow, I cannot type. Else our character.show. And just so we can wait until all of these characters fade in, if that's what we so choose, we can go ahead and come down here after we've called the logic on all the characters. And we can check if not immediate, meaning this is a transitional command, then we'll go ahead and say while we'll look at our characters.any, and check out each character as C, and just see if C.isRevealing is true. If any of the characters are revealing, we're going to yield, return, null, and wait for them to finish. Okay, and we can just go ahead and copy all of that and paste it into hide and just change a couple small things. The only thing that we're going to be changing is setting isVisible to false, changing show to hide, and changing isRevealing to isHiding. And there we go. Show all and hide all should be working. So we should be able to get all of our characters in the parameters. We should be able to find the parameter that we're looking for to see if this is immediate or not, and then run the logic. So that should be working right now. If we go to test file, then this should actually work. But again, it's not going to create the characters, it's just going to show them if they're already in the scene. So to actually make the characters, we're going to add one more command. This is going to be the create character command. And this is where we can do our character casting. So this command is going to look like create character, and then we'll specify the character name. So we'll say Stella, and then maybe we'll pass in a parameter to say whether this character should be enabled or not. So I might do that as E or enabled and make that true or false if I want to. So let's go ahead and make this one a reality. Coming back to our database, let's go ahead and add another command. So database.add_command, and we'll call this one create character to match what I was typing earlier. Now this one is going to be instant. There's no transition, no overtime thing here. So this one's going to be a new action, and we're going to take a string array for any parameters we might take, and then we're going to use a new function which we'll define down here. Public static void create character string array data. And so we'll specify that the logic we want to run is create character. Very simply, here's what we're going to do. All we're going to do is assume that the character name is the very first parameter being added in here. So string character name equals data 0. That should be the first one. And then the only other parameter I want is whether I want to enable this character on start or not. So enable false. Okay, now let's go ahead and grab the extra parameters. So var parameters equals convert to data to parameters, and we'll pass in our data. And then parameters dot try get value. We'll try to get a new string array so I can give multiple choices here. We'll do either tac E or tac enabled. And then I want to cast it out to enable. And I want to set the default value to false. So it won't enable them by default if I don't want it to. And then all I have to do is say character manager dot instance dot create character, and we're going to create a character using this character name, and then we'll set reveal after creation to enable, whatever we defined enable as. Okay, so now we have these three functions. See how easy this is with our database extensions? It's quite easy to make all of these commands come right to life, straight from your dialog files. So we're going to create Stella, and I'm also showing Raylene and Guard here. So enabled is actually going to be defaulted to false, so I can take care of that there. We'll go ahead and add one for Raylene. Whoops, come on now. Raylene, capital case doesn't matter there, I don't think. And then we'll say guard1 as well. Now guard1, I'm going to say enabled is true. So guard1 will be enabled at the start, but Stella and Raylene should fade in once we hit this show command. So let's just do narrator showing characters. Okay, let's see what this looks like. Okay, so this is good. This reminds me of something that we need to do. Command create character does not exist in the database. Command show does not exist in the database. Now we did add it, but we added it in lowercase. So I don't have case insensitivity on my commands. Now, if we look at the execute function in our command manager, we're grabbing the command from the database.getCommand. So let's go there real quick. And let's just go ahead and say command name equals command name dot toLower. And when we're adding a command, let's do the same thing. Command name equals command name toLower. So they're always going to be case insensitive. Okay, let's start it. Okay, and we see Raylene and Stella fade in, but Guard's not in there. And that's because guard1 was created as a text character because I don't have a character called guard1. I have a character called generic, so I need to cast that character. Very easily what I can do to make a multi-word parameter, I'll add the quotes in here, and then just say guard1 as generic. There we go. Okay, but it's a little hard to see whether that's actually working or not with the fading and the instant transition, because when you got stuff like that running when Unity first starts its the game mode here, the delay makes it hard to see what's going on. So let's quickly add a wait command as well, so that way we can wait for these things to happen. Now, I'm not talking about using the wait command header like we did right here, where we can wait for this one to finish until we move on to the next one. I'm talking about having a separate wait command altogether, where we'll say wait, and then wait like 1 second. So let's go ahead and add that into our database. I'm going to make one more database extension here, and this one is just going to be for general commands. So cmd database extension general. So inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and make a public static IEnumerator. Actually, that doesn't need to be public. That can be private. I'll make it a private static IEnumerator called wait, and take in a string array for the data. Actually, I only need one. I only need a value for the time. So we'll go ahead and say that database.add command. We'll add a command called wait, and we'll add a new func string IEnumerator from this wait coroutine. And inside of here, let's go ahead and try to parse and get a time for us. So if float.tryParse, we're going to try to parse our data, and we're going to cast it out to a float called time. If that works, then yield return new wait for seconds time. And if we go ahead and run this in Unity, we can see that it does not work. Now, technically it is working. It is running, and it is waiting for seconds, but it's not delaying anything else. Now, what we could do is go ahead and tell the system to wait for the wait command, but that is extremely redundant. Though that would work, it's stupid. So let's go through and make a way that we can cause this command to basically equal the same thing as telling another command to wait. Only it'll just be waiting for itself. Yes, I know we're jumping all over the place right now, but just follow along. So the reason this is happening is if we come into our managers for the conversation manager, when we look down at the commands being run, let's go to run commands. So here's where we're executing the commands for our dialog files. And only if the command wait for completion is tagged true, then we yield for the duration of that. And that's where the brackets wait header causes us to wait for the duration of any other commands. Now what sets that to true is if we have this little ID preceding our command. So we either want to look for something with that command or a command that is simply called wait. So let's go back to the conversation manager and change this up very slightly. And by very slightly, I mean very slightly. We'll say or command.name equals wait. That's it. And now let's go ahead and run this. And there we go. We do have a second delay there for the characters. But it kind of looked like our guard faded in, despite me telling him to immediately fade in. And that's actually because I was not thinking about this command, really. So when we go to create character, let's step over there real quick. Create character. If enabled, we're going to reveal after creation. Let's just hop into this command and see what that does. So if reveal after creation, character.show, which means it's fading in. So if I tell the character to be enabled on start, it's just going to fade in. Which technically that, I guess, is a good way to put this command. That just means that setting them instantly visible, I either need another parameter, or I just need to call show after the character is created. So I could just remove enabled, and then say show guard 1, and say I is true, and then we wait for the second, and immediately the guard is visible. I feel like I would like to make this part of the same command though. So by saying E is true, and then maybe saying I is also true, I think I'd like to do that. And this all comes down to personal preference to how you want to route your commands. And it may take trial and error. It may take just figuring out what feels most natural to you and what you would like to do with your project. So if I'm going to do that, then I just need to make another Boolean for immediate and set that to false by default. And then I'll duplicate this line and check for I or check for immediate, out immediate, and the default will be false again. So then if we reveal after creation, let me just check. So if not immediate, then yes, we will enable it. Otherwise, if we're doing an immediate transition, we'll say no because we don't want it to show the character and use that transition. Instead, what we'll do is say if immediate, then we could say character, we could define character equals the character that we create. As a matter of fact, let me just go ahead and remove reveal after creation there, because that's going to be false. So if immediate, then character dot is visible equals true, else if enable, then character dot show. Actually, not quite. If enable, then if immediate, oh good lord, let's go ahead and do never nesting. If not enable, then return. Otherwise, if immediate, then character dot is visible equals true, else character dot show. There we go. So we have to specify that we want to enable the character, and then we'll specify if we want them to be immediately visible or not. So this should now work to create our character and instantly set them as visible. There we go, and it does indeed work. So you can make these commands however you would like. Now, as we make more and more commands, you'll notice that I'm reusing some of these identifiers. immediate is so far used in 3 different functions, and I can assure you it's going to be used in much more. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take that value, and I'm going to come up top, and I'm just going to define some constant fields that I can reference for ease of use. And we'll add it up top here by saying private string array param immediate, and we'll define it as that new string array. And then we can do the same thing for enabled. So I'll call it enable. So we'll do E, and then enable. Okay, so I'll then replace this with param enable. Again, with our functions being static, these also need to be static as well. Okay, so param enable, and then this one's going to be param immediate. And then I could just go ahead and replace these down here, so they're all the same thing. And I can easily change and do whatever I want to with it later and have it reflect down to all of the other commands. Just one of those good coding practices to minimize these hard-coded strings wherever you may. Now, let's do one more command. Let's go ahead and make our character move on the screen. So we'll tell a character to move, and then we'll provide it a location, a speed, and whether we want it to be smooth or not. So we're going to have multiple parameters in here, and the reason I want to do this one is because there is a change that I want us to, well, there's an addition I want us to make to our parameters here that will allow us to kind of make it easier to write commands without having to specify each individual identifier label. So, like if we have a character and we want to say move Stella on the x-axis to the 0 location with a speed of 1.2 and using smoothing as false, it's not very intuitive maybe. We could instead do move Stella to 0 on the x at a speed of 1.2 and then with no smoothing. So we'd like to be able to have the option where it can go in automatically and try to find these parameters in order based on our configuration through the code. And if it finds these values for the parameters in order, it'll go ahead and assign them automatically even without the label. The label will just be there if we have parameters of the same type and we want to specify which one is which. So to start, let's go ahead and make our move command available to us. I'm going to make this command, I'm going to call it move character. And this one will be an IEnumerator. So why do I keep making these things public? Private static IEnumerator move character, and we'll take in a string array for the data. Okay, move character will then be move character. Okay, and I just need to change this to new func of string IEnumerator. There we go. All right. Okay, once again, just like we did for create character, let's assume that the first variable is our character. So string character name equals data 0. Now let's go ahead and try to start getting the character. So character equals character manager. dot get character, and we'll try to get it by the character name. So if our character equals null, yield break. Okay, so now the parameters that we could take in here, we'll take one for our float, the x position, as well as the y position. And then we'll also get our speed, which will just have a default of 2. And then we'll have a boolean for our smoothing. Actually, speed should be 1. That'll be a multiplier. So smooth will equal false, and bool immediate, in case we want to set the position, we'll set that to false as well. So we've got many variables that we can assign here. So let's go ahead and get our var parameters equals convert data to parameters. Now we got all of our parameters ready for us. So let's try to get the x-axis position. Parameters dot try get value. We're going to try to get the x position. So up top, I'm going to do x param x pose. This will just be a string. I'll make that x. That's it. Just that. Okay. Param x pose. And then out x. And then we'll go ahead and get parameters, try get value, and we'll try to get the y pose. So I'll duplicate this line, make that y pose, change this value to tag y, and say param y pose out y. Okay, next we want to get the speed. So try to get the speed. Parameters dot try get value, and we'll try to get the speed. Again, this is going to be something that we use frequently. So I'll make param speed, and that would be either SPD or SPEED. Param speed, and then out speed with a default value of 1. Next, let's try to get whether this is smooth movement or not. So once more, we'll do param smooth. We could even put these in a separate class somewhere. And then let's see if it is immediately setting the position or not. Okay, so with all of that in place, now let's go ahead and try to get the position in a vector2 format. My x and y are already floats, so I do not need that cast there. So we get our position, and then let's check if immediate. Then we're going to say character.set position, and set the position to our specified position. Otherwise, we're going to say, we're going to yield return character.move to position, and we're going to move to that position. We're going to move at our speed and by using smoothing. For some reason it thinks I'm trying to use system.numerics. Yeah, that's a Visual Studio auto-adding a namespace for me. I do not like that. So vector2 could not be found. I'm not using Unity Engine. So let's go ahead and make sure I'm using the Unity Engine namespace. And there we go. I got the vector2. So now we should be able to move our character. So let's see. Let's try, after we create Stella, let's go ahead and move Stella all the way to the left of the screen. And just move her a little slowly. Let's go 0.75. And smoothing will be false. And just make sure that I change move to move character, since that's the name of the command. Nothing happens because she's invisible right now. So let me just say Stella tac E true, so that way she gets enabled. There we go, and Stella has moved to the left side of the screen. Now, if I just go ahead and add in here I true to make this an immediate transition, there we go. It is immediate, and she shows up on the other side of the screen. Now, here's the thing. I may not want to specify each of these things individually. I could get away with saying that I could remove the X and remove the speed, possibly. Speed might actually be interpreted as Y, but we're going to look for the character name first, and then in the order that we sort the parameters, we would look for X, we would look for Y, we would look for smoothing, and then immediate. But as it stands, we can only find the parameters as long as they have that identifier in front of them. To make it shorthand when we don't need that, let's go ahead and change up our parameter class just a little bit. To do this, we're going to want a separate list of strings for our unlabeled parameters. That way we can still access them, and they just won't be paired to any identifiers. So we'll make a private list of string for our unlabeled parameters, and set that to a new, what is that? Okay, set that to a new list of strings. Okay, so if we find one that starts with a parameter identifier, we're going to add it to the parameters list. Otherwise, we're going to say unlabeled parameters.add parameter array I. So we'll go ahead and add these to that particular list. And now when we try to get the value, we're first going to check and see if there's anything assigned to a particular parameter name, and we'll try to get the value from there. If not, we'll go ahead and search all of the unlabeled parameters and try to get a matching value from out of that. So let's go ahead and do, so we'll return true if we find something. So if we've reached this point, if we reach here, no match was found in the identified parameters. So search the unlabeled ones if present. And then we'll just go through and look for those. That we actually need to come outside of that whole for each loop though. And we'll just copy that for each loop, paste it in here, but instead of going through parameters, we're going to go through unlabeled parameters. Okay, and we don't need the dictionary lookup there because we don't have a dictionary. So we're going to just look up the parameter name and try to find it and cast it out into the value we're looking for. If we find a value matching that, we're going to return true. Now, the problem with that is it's not actually going to proceed past, like, say, the first parameter. So if I specify of the same type, that is. So if I specify X without actually saying it's X, and then I also specify Y, and I want Y to be 1, it's going to go through each of these parameters. It's going to see Stella is unlabeled, and it's going to be like, nope, that's not a float, which is the type we're looking for. Then it's going to find 0. Okay, yeah, 0 is a float, so it's going to assign that to X. And then we go looking for Y. It looks for Stella, and then it looks for X. It says, hey, there's the float, but that's still X. So we need to remove the old parameters that no longer matter to us. And we could go through and just make a separate class that contains the name of the string and then a boolean saying if it's used or not, or we can just go ahead and remove it from the unlabeled parameters list. I don't see us having to come back and look for these parameters again once we've already gotten them once. So I'm just going to go ahead and in this, I will say unlabeled parameters dot remove parameter name. And if we play that, we can see that Stella gets spawned on the left side of the screen and she's a little higher. So now she's in her complete 1 position. And so it'll find the X, it'll find the Y. Let's just change that to 1.3 and we'll change this to 1 to take her to the other side. Actually, let's now make this negative 0.5. So she'll be going slightly below, and her speed will be 0.75, so we'll change smoothing to, we'll leave And we'll just get rid of smoothing altogether. We'll say I is false. I will actually be false by default, so we can leave that just like this. So she should move without specifying these parameters. Based off of how we configure the command, it will know which one is which. So if we go ahead and run this, there we go. She moves to the right of the screen. Doesn't look like her height changed any, but all the other parameters were working. And actually, height is not going to work for me because I'm starting it with the negative symbol, but it is going to interpret that as a parameter because minus is technically the parameter symbol. Didn't quite think that one through. But to solve that, I could just say negative y, or tac y for the y position, equals negative 0.5. You know, I didn't think that one through at all. Turns out I can't do that, because as we look for the next parameter, we're only going to take it as a value if it does not start with the parameter identifier. So I tell you what, let's add one small check here. Since I am so adamant on using this tac, I could easily change this for a different symbol and then just use that for my commands. But I am stubborn as a mule, so I'm going to stick with that, and I'm going to actually just add one small check to make sure this is not some kind of float value that we could use. If it's a number, then we're not going to assume that it's an identifier. Let's go ahead and do one more check and say if it starts with this parameter identifier, but float.tryparse must not succeed. If we're trying to check this and see if it is a float, we'll just cast it out to discard. We'll use underscore there, that way we discard it and don't have to save it to a temporary variable. So as long as this value is not interpreted as a number, then we will assume it is an identifier. So then test file this should actually work, and I can remove that identifier, and it will know that this is a number and not a parameter identifier. And Stella goes down. Let's just increase that a little bit more. So we'll make it 2, negative 2.5. And with that, Stella goes down even further. So we are recognizing numbers, negative numbers, as not being parameter labels. So that is good. So with that implementation in place, you technically don't even need to provide these labels. The labels will just make it easy to identify what is what. So instead of having, like, say, 1, and then true, and then other, and then yes, and then 14, and false, and true for some of these commands, which you look at that and you're like, what in the world? But you add in your identifiers and it'll make a little more sense. So it's just there for us as we need it. Whichever way we choose to do this, if you want to program it in with the values set in the order that they should be in, or you want to define them with their labels, or a mixture of both, that is entirely up to you. But there we go. So we have 4 commands that are working, and that is a good enough stopping point for now. I'm going to end it off here because this video is going a little long, and we'll just pick up in the next one and finish off some of the other commands. Alright, see ya.